Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's Fourth Space, and thank you for joining us for the final panel today of Convergences, the 2024 Literature Undergraduates Colloquium at Concordia. Just a quick reminder, we're running this event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat if you're joining us by Zoom. For those of you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Without further ado, let me hand it over to co-editor-in-chief of the magazine and co-organizer of this event, Emily Wilkinson. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our third panel. We've already had two amazing panels so far today, but let's just say we're saving the best for last. This third panel is called Our Spatial Realities. Once again, as we've been doing throughout the day, we've been getting together literature undergraduate students to engage with an idea or ideas outside of the world of literary studies. In this case, the three papers that we're going to be hearing today all relate to concepts of spatiality, how space is used, the significance of it, and we'll see that sort of in three kind of very different expressions. It's my pleasure to introduce as our special guest speaker for this panel, Cameron Brubacher. Cameron is also an undergraduate at Concordia in the honors urban planning program. I think he's an excellent choice to introduce these three essayists and these three papers today, especially because Cameron not only spends a lot of time, in the urban planning program thinking about space, but Cameron also has a special interest in literary geographies and sort of the intersection or convergences, if you will, between spatiality and literature. So with that, I will leave it to Cameron and our panelists.
Hello, yes, thank you, Emily, for that introduction. I'm Cameron, and as she mentioned, yes, so I am an urban planning geography student here at Concordia, finishing my undergraduate degree, so I imagine in a similar position to you guys. Yes, so I'm doing this honors undergraduate thesis research project, which is really, as she said, looking at the intersection between literature and geography, specifically in Montreal, the emotionality of urban spaces in Montreal's mid-20th century novels. So I'm looking at Gabriel Roy's Bonheur d'Occasion and Michel Tremblay's Les Chroniques du Plateau Montréal, and the ways that urban spaces are depicted in these novels and the characters and narratives that are found in there and the emotions that are expressed. So naturally, I'm coming more from maybe from a geographic or an urban planning background, but I have an interest and a love for literature on the side, and that's what I've been trying to do with my own research project, and that's what kind of you all have been trying to do, coming from the other direction, from literature and looking at its intersection with geography and space. So I'm really happy to be able to host this, to introduce you guys. And yeah, I very much look forward to the discussions that may come of them. So I will start by introducing our first reader, Jessica, who will be talking about Cottagecore in The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. So I will leave it to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be speaking again about Cottagecore. 16th century poet Christopher Marlowe is renowned for his intersections of pastoral poetry and fashion. His descriptions of fabric choices, color palettes, and aesthetic goals among nobles are especially prominent in The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. However, the noble's beautiful garments are never shown to be affected by the harsh realities of farming or animal husbandry, despite the obvious messiness that those activities entail. As such, Marlowe's poem exemplifies this trope in pastoral poetry, where the poem, commissioned by the aristocracy, misuses and misrepresents the aesthetics of the lower classes, favoring the fashionable aspects of their lives over the functional necessities. This type of trope is still common today. Cottagecore is a prime example of an aesthetically led fashion trend that is deeply connected to class privilege. This movement that is intrinsically linked with physical labor and messy work mirrors the genre of pastoral poetry. Both idealize the plight and working conditions of the lower class by placing their own impractical aesthetic needs over the functionality required to actually maintain this glamorized lifestyle. This idea is heavily demonstrated by examining the viral strawberry dress, which I believe over here, we should have an image of. And the imagery of golden slippers, soft woolen gowns, and embroidered floral caps in Christopher Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. So the concept of members of the aristocracy finding escape in rural paradise is not new. According to Angelica Frey, the concept of cottagecore has been around for over 2,000 years. So citing roots in ancient Greek longings for Arcadia, a paradise free from the disease, corruption, and pollution of Athens, Frey explains that cottagecore can be traced throughout most of human history as a deep longing to escape turmoil. As a concept, cottagecore aims to embody a connection to nature and the land by engaging with traditional homestead activities, things like bread making, gardening, and textile arts. Similarly, journalist Isabel Sloan describes cottagecore as an aesthetic movement where rural self-sufficiency converges with dainty decor to create an exceptionally twee distillation of pastoral experience. A trend of young adults coping with midlife crises amidst the chaos of late-stage capitalism and the COVID-19 pandemic by idolizing a slow-paced life filled with foraging, baking, and crafts. While today cottagecore and pastoral motifs can be seen often through social media, historically they appeared most prominently in literature. Theocritus's Idyls are considered to be the first example of pastoral poetry, featuring shepherds raised far above their social standing, who spend their lives idling by rivers and participating in singing contests. Virgil's Eclogues use pastoralism to explore his contemporary issues without having to directly engage with them, discussing life in the aftermath of Caesar's death with heavy focus on themes of war and violence. Many Renaissance poets used pastoral poetry as a method of criticizing their world without having to directly engage with those in power, much like the anti-capitalist roots of the cottagecore movement. They used illusion and symbolism to create worlds much like their own, where young idealist heroes could raise issues with the ruling classes. However, the poets themselves did not hold the positions of power that protected them from the consequences of criticizing their employers. Hence, their characters are written so as to not be seen as reflective of their own beliefs. The times of crisis and war witnessed by Theocritus and Virgil saw a rise in popularity of pastoral poetry, mirroring the rise in popularity of cottagecore content produced during the peak of the global quarantine. The connection between cottagecore content and political instability is clear, but the link between pastoral poetry and cottagecore aesthetics and wildly impractical garments is less obvious. This will be elaborated on through an examination of the poem and current cottagecore fashion trends. So, in Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, the speaker invites the reader, his lover, to join him on a farm for a life dedicated to luxury and delight. His first stanza extends the invitation and sets the scene. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasure prove. The valleys, groves, hills, and fields, woods, or steepy mountain yields. Their life will be filled with all imaginable forms of pleasure. The difficult and vast terrain acts as a backdrop for the epic love, as opposed to a farmer's obstacle or a shepherd's workspace. To these lovers, a steep mountain is something to marvel at, as opposed to a treacherous climb. The speaker's vivid descriptions of their beautiful future continue in the second stanza, while expanding on what the pair will find in their woodland paradise. And we will sit upon the rocks, seeing the shepherds feed their flocks by shallow rivers to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. The lovers don't have to feed their own flock, but get to lay back and watch the shepherds do the actual farm work. They will frolic by riverbeds, lay on rocks, and listen to the glorious music of the songbirds, having the privilege to relax and truly enjoy the natural world as they encounter it. Having set the scene and introduced the workers and animals who will cohabitate with them, Marlowe's speaker then turns his attention back to that which he can offer his lover. For the first time in the poem, he describes actions he'll do himself as opposed to passive viewership. And I will make thee beds of roses and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cap of flowers and a kirtle, embroidered all with leaves of myrtle. This stanza is where the connection of pastoral poetry to aestheticized fashion over function and upper-class ignorance becomes irrefutable and obvious. The speaker describes beautifully ornate objects that are wildly impractical, financially irresponsible, and simply out of reach of the majority of Renaissance England's shepherds. While a bed of roses and posies may look lush and inviting, it would take years of cultivating and proper horticulture to plant, harvest, and then uproot that many roses. A bed made of roses and posies would only last for a short period and would likely be quite uncomfortable. A cap and kirtle made of flowers with myrtle embroidery would be breathtakingly gorgeous, but provide no protection from the elements, would be nearly impossible to craft, and could never be reworn. These images involve a sense of upper-class privilege, taking from land, giving nothing in return, and not considering the physical toll on the earth or the workers tasked with bringing these flowers and ornate objects into being. This reliance on extravagant fashion in pastoral poetry lines up with the boom and popularity of cottagecore that became intrinsically linked to Matoshi's strawberry dress, a tulle midi gown costing nearly $500 US. In her article examining the dress's pop culture moment, Sarah Spelling says that the dress is popular precisely because it is not practical. It's over the top and fanciful. This notion of impractical fashion in rural settings is mirrored in Brian Holmes' slutty embellishments, Elizabethan fashion, and projections of decadence in Marlowe's Hero and Leander. While Holmes examines a different work by Marlowe, he uses theories brought forth in Philip Stubbs' Anatomy of Abuses to discuss the transformation that occurs in a body when it is clothed in fanciful, extravagant materials. Stubbs says that clothing can transform a body, acting as a means to step into a different class, race, gender, or societal role than the wearer would typically embody. Pastoral poetry and cottagecore TikToks allow consumers to engage with this over-the-top fashion and aesthetic extravagance that they're likely unable to access in their real lives. This transformation, however, is purely an aesthetic one, as a peasant status will not be changed by donning golden shoes, and one cannot join the upper echelon of the 21st century by wearing an expensive gown. Both pastoral poetry and cottagecore TikToks allow the consumer to briefly live in a fantasy, enjoying the idea of extravagant clothing that ultimately will have no true impact on their economical or social situations. The momentary engagement is escapism. The user is shown the potential for a life of luxury where one can live on land and own and eat food one has grown oneself, in clothing that would never survive under actual farming conditions. This phenomenon of the historically anti-capitalist cottagecore movement and its ties to consumerism and fast fashion were examined in Taking the Past Out of the Pastoral by Antonetta Televa and Catherine Ryan. Their paper reaffirms that cottagecore transforms rural farm life into an easily digested performance. Their examination of cottagecore as a queer frontier space explains how it aestheticizes the privilege of not having to work hard to maintain a land and a life that, in reality, is extremely difficult and labor-intensive. Televa and Ryan explain that the content is largely aspirational, and those with the financial means to live the cottagecore and pastoral lives often downplay the amount of labor and money that goes into their daily lives. In order to wear delicate tulle dresses and embroidered aprons, they must buy high-quality clothing that can withstand their daily wear and tear. In order to spend their days baking bread and gardening, they must have access to land, stable finances, and often childcare. They can luxuriate in a slow life and make their butter from scratch because many of these figures have the free time and financial freedom to do so. As in Marlowe's passionate shepherd to his lover, those with the means to truly enjoy the cottagecore lifestyle spend their excess income on impractical, ornate fashion, mirroring their lack of true interest and acknowledgement of the difficulties of an actual rural life. The money used to pay shepherds and farmhands translates into money used to pretend one is doing work. The elegance and opulence of pastoral fashion combined with the serenity of its rural backdrop represents the ultimate escape in Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. This form of escapism is mirrored in cottagecore TikTok trends, especially when considering the Matoshi strawberry dress. While this fantasy is most widely accessible to the upper classes, able to afford land, sustainable fashion, and time off to pursue hobbies, it is idealized by the working class. The upper class who can participate in these seemingly slow rural activities do so in opulent fashion and without extensive labor, appropriating the fashion and culture of the lower class in their version of pastoral escape. The popularity and appeal of Matoshi's strawberry dress and a close reading of Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Lover both show the unattainable dreams of cottagecore. The passionate shepherd and the strawberry dress embody the upper class's skewed views of pastoral life through the lens of fashion and consumerism.
Thank you. That was great. That's obviously a very beautiful poem, and I think you did a great job of bringing it into our present moment. I think actually I'd like to see if there were any questions now, particularly pertaining to this reading, either from the audience, but I'll start myself. I'm curious. I'm not on TikTok all that much, although one can't really avoid seeing some. And I'd just be curious for you to explain to me, and maybe the audience who may also be unaware, like what is this TikTok cottagecore trend? Like, what is the average cottagecore video? Obviously, there's this strawberry maxi dress, but if maybe you can describe TikTok. I can't believe I'm asking you to do that.
Absolutely. So cottagecore really hit its peak right around the time the pandemic also peaked. So I would say 2019 to 2021 was when it was extremely popular, and if you were online at all, it was pretty much impossible to avoid the videos showing it. And a lot of it is focusing on specifically women wearing generally, again, very nice, luxurious clothing. And they're talking about how they are living this slow life and how they're able to take breaks from work. And they're doing a lot of what are seen as traditionally feminine things. It's a lot of cooking, a lot of baking, but the bread you're baking is sourdough from the starter that you made yourself. And the things that you're sewing are not usually like practical garments, but tend to be mostly things like embroidery and home decor, embroidering a pillow, or just generally impractical things. And it's people who are gardening and they're out in fields. And so there is kind of two sections of it, which are the people creating and engaging with cottagecore kind of right where it started, and then the people who are living in more urban spaces or who don't have access to the time and finances it takes to have hobbies like that and to be making bread all day. And those are the people who tended actually to be buying this dress the most often. So it was, again, mostly women and mostly young women. So generally, I'm gonna say ages like 16 to early 30s were probably the target audience. And it was a lot of women having picnics in the park, wearing these very gorgeous dresses that were probably full of grass stains and mud by the end. And planting things on their balconies. So engaging in what are a lot of traditionally very feminine activities with the same 5 or 6 very kind of upbeat songs behind them.
Great. Are there any questions from the audience for Jessica? No?
We actually have a question on Zoom.
Great.
Hey, so this question is from Kate Ellis. Kate says, I have noticed a trend among right-wing Christians posting content that romanticizes cottagecore/homestead living. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the way that this aesthetic intersects with this kind of political ideology/orientation.
I do, Kate. Thank you very much. So there actually is a huge amount of overlap. There's also a lot of overlap with this alt-right community that is mostly known as tradwives. I don't know if people have heard about this, but it's essentially a group of women who post online a lot and idealize being at home. And a lot of them are coming at it in that lens specifically from also a very conservative Christian background of the reason they're staying at home is in order to be submissive and in order to provide and in order to do child care and make sure that their husbands are as well taken care of as possible so that there's the least amount of pressure on them and that they can properly and in the godly fashion lead their household and be the community leaders that their faith wants them to be. A lot of the capitalism that has stemmed from taking advantage almost of what cottagecore has become relates directly to very right-wing Christian beliefs, which are that what are seen as typically very feminine activities are actually the natural and correct role that women need to be taking in order to do what they're supposed to be doing. There's also, within that community, a lot of overlap between people who are doing a mixture of kind of mommy vlogging tradwife content, so using their children to show all of the ways in which they're homeschooling and they're raising their children on the land. And they're not showing necessarily the streams of income that are supporting them, or they're saying, I'm putting so much effort into making sure that my children are being raised by me and in our community in the most kind and loving way and the most natural way possible. And because of that, my husband is able to provide all of this for us. So it's absolutely achievable. When a lot of them, there was an account a few months ago where she had been talking directly about the fact that she's able to do this, allows her husband to take care of them financially, and so that's why they're able to afford all this. And it turned out that her parents owned Porter Airlines, and that's actually how they were able to support that. But she was not at all being transparent about that. And there's a huge amount of overlap between communities that are very far right, very Christian, kind of not explicitly showing that side of their belief in order to essentially make propaganda videos that show, you know, if you live our lifestyle, maybe you'll be able to get what we have. And then the further you go into that, the easier it is to fall deeper into alt-right and very conservative Christian ideologies.
Interesting. It's interesting to see how these sort of traditional values, heteronormative values, are very much associated with rural spaces. I think I'll move on to the next reader. We will hopefully have time to go to have more questions for everyone at the end. But next is Emily. We'll be discussing bone and bread.
Hi. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about Michel Foucault's theory of heterotopias, and I'm going to be connecting it to Salima Nawaz's Bone and Bread. So Salima Nawaz's Bone and Bread follows the narrative of Bina, an Indo-Canadian citizen who undergoes life-altering scenarios that shape the way in which she views the world, the passing of multiple family members, and the political movement advocating for the freedom of a refugee family. She experiences shifts in thinking, in her awareness of her surroundings, and in her understanding of her trauma. These thought processes can be explained using Michel Foucault's 6 principles of heterotopology as outlined in his article of Other Spaces, Utopias, and Heterotopias. According to Foucault, heterotopias, which he defines via 6 principles, are malleable spaces that have both physical and symbolic presence. Breaking down the interactions and events in Nawaz's novel through the lens of each of Foucault's principles, I will demonstrate how the internal spaces of memory and interiority in the novel are constantly moving in and out of time with physical spaces. Thus, this story of family, loss, illness, and discrimination demands that we reconsider spaces to which we would have otherwise not given a second thought. Foucault's first principle of heterotopias simply states that no society exists without the presence of heterotopias, whether they be of crisis or deviation. The latter are physical places intended to group people who are deviant in relation to the required mean or norm, spaces such as rest homes, psychiatric wards, and prisons. Bone and Bread offers several examples of heterotopias of deviation, such as the various psych wards Sadhana is placed in for her anorexia, as well as the church where immigrant refugees are hiding to avoid deportation. Sadhana is in and out of hospitals throughout the novel for anorexia relapses. The wards that she is placed in recall Foucault's heterotopias of deviation, as they are spaces specifically made for a subgroup of people who share a common illness. Even with the windows closed, the sounds of the street leaked through, shrieks of cars braking as ambulances pulled straight into rush hour. The air conditioning, too, was chilly. In the anorexia ward, they kept it turned down because the girls got too cold. This space is not only deviant in that it is designated for a specific group of othered people, it also takes on its own unique deviant qualities by virtue of the people who inhabit it. The sounds related to the urgency of ambulances as well as the temperature in the ward. Another of the novel's heterotopias of deviation stems from Bassam and his family immigrating to Canada illegally from Algeria. They reside in the upstairs room of a church, which Bassam frames as a kind of parallel nation. Welcome to our country. For us, this is Canada. This room. This is Quebec. It is smaller than yours, maybe. As not only immigrants, but also illegal immigrants, this family is symbolically positioned outside of society, even as they are forced into the heterotopia of deviation that is their living space. This example also showcases how heterotopias can be interpreted in different ways depending on who inhabits them. This family does not live in the same Quebec that Bina and Sadana live in. Although geographically it is the same place, it is viewed and experienced in inherently different ways. Foucault's second principle of heterotopias states that society, as its history unfolds, can make an existing heterotopia function in a very different fashion. What Foucault means by this is that the heterotopias can change their function over time. He stresses the idea that time and space flow in and out of one another, with time appearing to us only as one of the various distributive operations that are possible for the elements that are spread out in space. Spaces and the meanings they convey are constantly changing over time, an aspect of space which Bone and Bread demonstrates in significant ways. Because the novel deals with a great amount of death, it features spaces which, once inhabited by certain characters, shift drastically after those characters' deaths. Two examples of this principle are the apartment Bina lived in with her mom and Sadana's own apartment. After their uncle takes it over, the physical space of the apartment Bina had shared with her mom and sister growing up still has the same four walls and is located in the same place above the bagel shop. However, it does shift in physical appearance. Yet, while objects and furniture are removed, what's important to note is that the presence of the life that was once lived there does not leave with these tangible items. Piece by piece, after we moved out, Sadana and I carried away almost every item we could claim as our mother's. But there are still a few lingering signs of her, even so long after her death. Space is physically malleable, but the history it holds remains present despite the space's new function. Similarly, as Bina removes things from Sadana's apartment after her sister's death, the space is physically deconstructed, but the moments spent there linger nonetheless. As Bina reflects, there's a lot of sorting to be done. The clothes, the books, the furniture. The room still teems with Sadana, strands of black hair along the green couch cushions, the magazines stacked underneath the table in three proportional piles of fashion, art, and music. The heterotopia that is Sadana's apartment shifts in terms of its purpose, becoming a space that Bina needs to sort through instead of the space where Sadana once lived. Still, Sadana's presence remains in traces, and the old function of the space can be spotted through the ways she had made this resident uniquely hers. Another characteristic of heterotopias as defined by Foucault is the fact that the heterotopia is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place several spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible. Here, he uses the example of cinemas, where one is physically taking up space while simultaneously watching the projection of a three-dimensional space. This notion allows for multiple spaces to be present at the same time, intertwining in and out of one another within the same heterotopia. This principle broadens the definition of heterotopias, showcasing how they can comprise spaces that exist beyond the tangible. This is represented in the novel through the internal spaces of memories, journals, and the physical presence of the deceased. Flashbacks of Sadana rise to the surface of Bina's mind frequently in the novel, recollections that she defines as a space around the thought of her. She explicitly labels these memories as taking up room in physical space, even if they occur within her mind. In a blink, an image comes to me of Sadana, unmoving on the floor of her kitchen, and a quiver seizes my back. Not only does the internal space of memories take up room in the mind, but they also have a physical effect on Bina. She feels them in her body, and they become a part of her living space. A similar tension between a past and a present inhabiting the same space can be seen when past moments that fill up the pages of Sadana's journals occupy space such as physical books in the present. When Bina finds these old journals while clearing out Sadana's apartment, she seals them all into a new box without reading, having no desire to relive those fights with Sadana. Bina knows that if she were to read these journals, she would be mentally brought back to the traumatic moments they encompass. Although she occupies the present space, the content of these journals also holds the memories of past spaces, and reading them would put Bina in both places at once. Yet, another example of this principle worth noting is the way Sadana's presence continues to be felt in space, even without a body that can occupy that space. She is seen and felt after her death, whether it be through memories of her characteristics that are mirrored in relatives, or projections of how she would react in certain scenarios if she were still alive. It's like Sedana's at my ear, egging me on. Bina thinks, feeling the presence of her sister and imagining what she might have said in that moment if she were still alive. Growing up, Bina had compared herself to her sister in looks and social status. She wonders what Sedana would say if she knew my jealousy extended even beyond death. Bina feels the emotions that come with being an older sister to Sedana, even in the present space she occupies. It's almost as if Sedana is still there somehow, though her physical body is not. These two realities, both the intangible reality of Bina's thoughts and physical reality Bina inhabits, exist in tension, yet manage to occupy the same space. The mental extends itself even further into the physical realm in similarities Bina notices between her sister and her own son. I can see my sister strong in him, her tastes and opinions. She also notices how Quinn's laugh comes out throaty, commanding attention, Sedana's laugh. Sedana consistently makes mental and physical appearances in the world she once inhabited. Again, the intangible and the tangible come together in what Foucault would consider a heterotopia. Shifting our focus from the physical to the temporal, a further principle of Foucault's heterotopias articulates that, although time and space ultimately flow in and out of one another, many heterotopias are linked to slices in time, such as cemeteries that only gain their purpose once a life is lost. However, he also acknowledges that there also exists heterotopias that are indefinitely accumulating time, such as museums and libraries, where time never stops building up and topping its own summit. Both of these variants can be read in Bone and Bread. A heterotopia that is explicitly tied to a point in time in the novel is that of space dedicated to the protest in support of Bassam's family. It takes up the physical space of the park, facing the government building housing the Department of Immigration, at the specific date and time of the tribunal hearing that is set to decide whether or not the Algerian family can stay in Quebec. A crowd gathers, speeches are made. A member of the Algerian community talks about Bassam's struggle to leave the country and his efforts to assist other refugees and new immigrants. And another man mounts the steps of the immigration building and leads the crowd in a chant, culminating in claps and cheers, whistling, and the waving of signs. Echoing Foucault's space as a slice of time, this space of protest and unity comes together at a specific point in time for a particular purpose. At any other time, this space would just look like a patch of land. However, the novel primarily explores spaces that represent accumulating archives of the past and present. All events from the past spill over into the present, almost like dominoes. Every decision, encounter, or incident will ultimately impact the ones to follow, even in ways that may seem unnoticeable. As Bina puts it, as raindrops strike the water, they generate a rippling mass of circles that radiate and overlap. I gestured earlier to the ways Sedana's apartment is composed of remnants of her existence, like a museum of her life. But, using Foucault's principle of indefinitely accumulating time, one can see even more clearly how the apartment piles past and present on top of one another. Upon Sedana's mantelpiece, there are photos, a couple of the two of us, one of Mama, more of Quinn, many of friends. This group of photos from different periods in Sedana's life is a visual representation of the temporal accumulation. Foucault's next principle, Principle 5, asserts that heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. Heterotopias are oftentimes entered through a door-like system, making them distinct from other spaces which separate those on the inside from those on the outside. One such example of penetrable space mentioned several times in the novel is the space of silence. Although this space cannot be entered by a physical opening, it can be so easily pierced by noise, such as talking. Bouts of silence between Bina and Quinn are heterotopic spaces whose nature can be felt as palpably as real spaces because they are loaded with overwhelming emotions of hostility. That quiet inhalation, audible as he pushes past, that's the sound of him blaming me. Bina also frames silence in spatial terms when she references the space of silence of Quinn not answering. However, this atmosphere of emotion can be penetrated through the act of breaking the silence. The months following Sedana's death are filled with many of these moments of insulating silence. Yet, one day, she decides to break this space open by calling out, "We're going to Montreal." And though at first I can't hear a response, in a moment there are his footsteps on the stairs, springing to life. The space of silence is permeated and disrupted by the sound of Bina's voice, inviting Quinn to go somewhere else. The sixth and final principle of Foucault's heterotopias is that they have a function in relation to all the space that remains. To illustrate this, he uses the analogy of the creation of colonies, which were made to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled. This definition can be expanded if we consider that, while colonies are an attempt to reconstruct a space, they are simultaneously taking up the physical space of what was there first, which was often whole civilizations. In Bone and Bread, the past and present are constantly flowing in and out of one another in this way, demonstrating how all spaces function in relation to one another. Space does not exist without time, and time does not exist without space. One might consider the layout of Bina's family's old apartment after her father dies as an example of this principle that creating a space upon another does not equate to the erasure of the first space. It was no longer the spoiled child of fire and water, the green rug on the front stairs soaked by the firefighters where it was spared by the flames has been torn up and replaced by a blue one. The drywall all along the entryway has been patched up, and everywhere, as far as the fire had penetrated, had a new coat of paint. This apartment is based upon an accumulation of past events and present remodeling. Even though new physical aspects have taken over the old ones, the history of what happened there will never be forgotten. Just like a colony, what was once beneath the fresh paint and new carpeting will forever linger within the heterotopic space of this apartment. It is still located above the bagel shop that caused the fire which altered Bina's and her family's lives forever. Another example of present spaces coexisting with past ones that they are built upon is Uncle taking over Bina's father's bagel shop. Bina recounts how Uncle went in ahead of me. "Come in," he said, which reminded me that it was his office and had been for 20 years, even though I still think of it as belonging to my father. Although Bina's uncle has taken over this space, her father's presence will always remain. The space taken up by the bagel shop would not be complete without acknowledging the hands that previously steered the ship. Essentially, this last principle of Foucault's ties together all the previous ones and re-emphasizes the notion that time and space are co-reliant, constantly moving around one another like the earth and the sun. As Foucault argues, it is such an intertwining of space and time that creates these heterotopias of infinitely open space, where everything is interrelated and everything is possible. It is important to note that only so much can be said in a few pages about the interaction of time and space. But a good place to start is understanding that a thing's place is no longer anything but a point in its movement, just as the stability of a thing is only its movement indefinitely slowed down. The heterotopology that one can read in Bone and Bread demonstrates how, even when things seem to be stable, they are not unmoving. Yet that messiness of overlapping temporality and spatiality, of places piled on places, memories intruding into present moments, is the nature of our reality. And as such, these heterotopias represent the real spaces we inhabit. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That when I first read this, it very much resonated with me personally, looking at these sort of more abstract notions of space and how they can be applied to literature through these theorists like Foucault. But instead of entering into that kind of like theoretical drivel, I thought I find it also interesting in the case of this novel, Bone and Bread, and its discussion of immigrants in Montreal and immigrant spaces in the city. If I understand correctly, it takes place in both Ottawa and Montreal, the novel.
It does take place in Montreal.
Great.
Yeah.
So yeah, while I was reading this, thinking about the heterotopic nature of immigrant spaces in Montreal, I couldn't help but thinking about the present moment, thinking about perhaps the recent closure of Roxham Road, or I believe there's plans to sort of like renovate and expand the immigration detention center in Laval. So this was just swimming in my head when I was reading it, so I wanted to maybe welcome you to speak to the contemporary, like the nature of this immigrant narrative in Montreal. It's a very open-ended question.
Yeah, it's very open-ended for sure. I mean, I think Montreal in general is a very multicultural city, and we do have this very big immigrant community, and it's amazing. But the thing is, I think, which we see in the novel, I didn't really touch on it too much, but it is a very prevalent point in the novel as well, is this immigrant family that comes here, and although they come here, which is quote unquote illegal according to the government standards, they receive very different accommodations in terms of their immigrant status, and they end up being closed off into this little room where they can't even roam freely. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that although Montreal does have this very big immigrant community and these accommodations and these advocacies and all that, that we do have to acknowledge the time and space that I discussed in this article, how their reality is not the same as our reality. And no matter how many accommodations we do give them and recognition we give to any type of minority group, whether it be immigrants, whether it be the LGBTQ, whether it be indigenous communities, like they will never, no matter how many accommodations we do give them, they will never experience the same reality as us because they are living in this different space. So the most we can do as a city and as a community would be to make this space as comfortable and open as possible, but it is still important to acknowledge that they will always have a unique space compared to us.
Yes, definitely. So the way that immigrants and other marginalized communities experience different spaces of the city is inherently different than perhaps the average resident of the city, leading to these different heterogeneous layers of the same spaces in the city, as was very well described in your essay. So thank you. I will now move to the next speaker, Morgan, who will be discussing liminality and ecocriticism in Irish short stories. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take advantage of being last just to thank everybody who's been involved. So we have Louise, and then my lovely editor, Emily. Sorry, Emily's not my editor. The other co-editor-in-chief, Emily, and then my editor, Rosanna. And then congrats to everybody for speaking and writing amazing essays, because it's actually terrifying. My head is not following the mic, but it's terrifying to stand up here and read to you guys. And I think everybody's done an amazing job. And thank you to you guys for finding time during finals to listen to us talk about things that we're just really excited about. So yeah, I guess with that said, oh, also little caveat. Okay, I wrote this essay a year ago, and I used the word cinematographically, but my first language is French, and I don't know where to put the emphasis in that word. So it's gonna come up in the essay, and I'll probably mispronounce it. Okay, so my essay, Between Green Spaces, Liminality and Ecocriticism in the Contemporary Irish Short Story. The short story occupies a nebulous space in contemporary literature. It is often considered to be precise and a demanding genre, while also serving as the doorway into prose for aspiring novelists. The Irish short story in particular occupies a secondary liminality, according to Irish short story writer Frank O'Connor. He positions the genre on the cusp between tradition and modernity. Thus, the Irish short story genre occupies a liminal space in terms of literary importance and is a bridge between the past and present. Both Kevin Barry's Dark Lies the Island and Eilish Ní Domhnai's Little Red and Other Stories are collections of Irish short stories that textually and thematically embody the genre's liminality. However, I would argue that while Barry and Ní Domhnai utilize liminality, their collections can still be read ecocritically, with ecocriticism being a way for scholars to examine the global climate crisis in literature, culture, physical space. Ecocritical arguments about Irish short stories heavily rely on a sense of place. Hence, a conflict arises between liminality and the ecocritical concreteness of place. I will endeavor to resolve this conflict by highlighting how liminality and environmental descriptions coexist in both collections, allowing the short stories to mount nuanced ecocritical arguments that echo the precipice on which the environment stands today. So many short stories from both collections reference liminal non-spaces as a means to explore modernity and its dismissal of the environment. French anthropologist Marc Auger coins the phrase non-place to refer to places where human beings remain anonymous and become no more than the sum of their actions or experiences as a customer, passenger, or driver. Non-places range from grocery stores to highways to airports. In Barry and Ní Domhnai's collection, Auger's concept is often linked with the notion of liminality, which leave the characters with no true physical reference points. In Barry's A Cruelty, non-spaces and liminality coincide on the Dublin-Sligo train. The passengers are boiled down to their daily commute and are placed in a state of limbo between their home and workplace. The Irish landscape passes them by without providing any geographical grounding. However, the main character, Donnie, gains individuality within the liminal non-place of the train. As he enters the train, Donnie is merely referred to as he. There are no defining features attributed to him aside from his gender. is only once Donnie acknowledges the natural environment outside of the train that he acquires a name. That's not a bad-looking day at all, Donnie says. It is his joke to say this in all weathers. The ticket inspector, on the other hand, to whom Donnie makes his comment, is never defined beyond his role as the governing agent of the liminal non-place, and does not answer Donnie. The narration instead shifts from their interaction to the sounds of the coming train. This works in two ways. One, it demonstrates the value placed onto technology and modernity over the environment. And two, it suggests that the ticket inspector did not laugh or even understand the joke due to his lack of awareness of the environment. Donnie instead notices the environment, which provides a physical grounding, in turn allowing him to retain his individuality in the liminal non-place. The narrator calls out the scenery that Donnie watches go by with a repetition of now. Now the broken down still walls of the old rising fields, now the mournful cows still wet from the dew and night's drizzle. Now the greenish tone of the galvanized tin roof on the lost shack. The continually emphasized now, coupled with the natural imagery of old fields and cows, make for environmental reference points that ground Donnie within the liminal non-place. The natural scenery takes him out of the modern train. Nidubne's Baltic Amber simply explores a liminal non-place, an airport in this case. Auger homes in on airports and airplanes as non-places where singular identities and interpersonal relationships are negated by the experience of solitude and similitude. Like the train, airports and airplanes are representative of technology and modernity encroaching on the natural world. Furthermore, they embody a liminal space in which passengers must wait at their assigned place to get their original location to their destination. In this purgatorial state, those who travel by plane are rendered anonymous and can only be defined by their contribution to pollution. While Baltic Amber does not take place entirely in an airport, the narrative focuses on this setting as Linda reflects on her time with her husband. In contrast to Barry's Donnie, Nidubne's main character, Linda, does not maintain her individuality in the liminal non-place, but can identify her husband, David. In other words, while Barry presents a gain of individuality, Nidubne shows an ability to distinguish one person amongst others in a non-place. Taking into consideration Auger's arguments regarding the negation of interpersonal relationships by the experience of solitude, Linda's ability to recognize her husband in the airport becomes worth exploring. David never spotted her or anyone. Linda, in contrast, loved the moment when David would emerge, smiling, looking all around. I propose that, like Donnie, Linda's ability to recognize people in non-places stems from her eco-consciousness, displayed through her choice in earrings. In the last few years, ambers have become a source of environmental damage. Illegally mined in Ukraine and Russia, amber results in barren landscapes and leveled forests. Pieces of amber with plants or wildlife involved within it, like those gifted to Linda, are particularly sought after. Thus, when David purchases amber earrings for Linda, he takes part in an economy that is destroying the environment. David's environmental carelessness is further accentuated by his frequent flying for conferences. As such, David has no reason to be able to navigate the anonymous crowd in the non-place of the airport. When Linda, however, must buy earrings for herself, she chooses mother of pearl fake. This seemingly offhand comment about her earrings' fakeness directly refers to a previous statement of David's that the amber was real. As a consequence, Linda, who is more respectful of the environment, exemplified by her purchase of fake pearl earrings, is able to recognize an individual in spite of the non-place. Respecting or being aware of the natural environment is presented as a means to escape the anonymity of a non-place in both short stories. Moving away from non-places, I now turn to haunting as a representation of liminality to eco-critically position Barry's Dark Lies Island and Nidubne's New Zealand flax. So while Sarah from Barry's Dark Lies Island is haunted by nature's adoption of a gothic voyeuristic quality, and Frida from Nidubne's New Zealand flax is haunted by a loved one that reinforces her connection with nature, both characters carry forward a sexual deviancy. So before delving into the short stories, I have to establish how I use the term haunting throughout this essay. So rather than limit the term to ghosts, I use the following definition of haunt. One, of diseases, memories, cares, feelings, thoughts, to visit frequently and or habitually, to come up or present themselves as recurrent influences or impressions, especially as causes of distraction or trouble, to pursue or molest. And then two, of imaginary or spiritual beings, to visit frequently and habitually with manifestations of their influence and presence. So for a character to be haunted, they are necessarily coming into contact with a thought or a being that is situated in the liminal space between the physical and the imaginary. The haunter is something that cannot be physically interacted with, such as thoughts or spirits, but leaves a visual impression on the haunted. As such, Dark Lies the Island and New Zealand Flax support an analysis of liminality as eco-critical. The titular story, Dark Lies the Island, presents the supporting characters and nature as gothic voyeurs that haunt the main character from the liminal modernized space of the internet. In his essay, Black and White Flickering, the Visual Cycle in Kevin Barry's short fiction, Gregory Decter suggests Dark Lies the Island uses cinematographic language to bring a dreamlight state into reality. He does not take into consideration that the visual film-like language lends itself to a gothic voyeurism. Classic Gothic literature is often associated with sexual perversion, which in many cases presents itself through voyeurism and the impression of being watched. Therefore, the short story, like Gothic literature, can be read as exploring a liminal state through the main character's voyeuristic haunting. Dark Lies the Island is underscored by a sexual mood, a menacing sexual mood. In juxtaposing Sarah's desire to self-harm with off-hand sexual suggestions, the deviant voyeurism takes form. When Sarah writes on the forum about her intention to harm herself later that night, Candy Deleuze answers, "You cut tonight, you photo, and you show me, you hot fucking bitch." The screen name of the character itself is sexually loaded in her self-identifying as Candy Deleuze, the name Candy being associated with sex work in contemporary pop culture. Furthermore, the voyeuristic desire to watch is sexualized and doubly perverted in the juxtaposition of Candy asking for photos of self-harm, followed by an appeal to Sarah's physicality. The double perversion is enhanced when Sarah's father suggests that his daughter is spending her time at the cottage masturbating. The people around Sarah have a desire to know or to watch her sexual accents, yet they are in liminal technological spaces. Candy writes on a forum that places her at once with Sarah and far away from her. Her dad occupies a similar space on the phone where he is both in the cottage with Sarah and in Granada. The association of sexual perversion and technological liminal spaces problematizes technology and modernity. Additionally, Sarah allows herself to become nature's victim due to her mass consumeristic lifestyle. Sarah's family, especially her father, is wealthy, which is made obvious through her father being an architect, her parents traveling the world, and their beautiful cottage built on a bog. Building on this fact, Sarah's family plays into the contemporary stereotype of rich parents abandoning their child to a secluded place while they travel. Sarah herself fits into the mold of the spoiled child who becomes depressed out of boredom. Thus, Sarah and her family can be read as the natural extension of these stereotypes, mass consumers. This is relevant to Sarah is haunted by her own environment. Through the visual language of film, the short story transposes the supporting characters' desire to watch onto Sarah's environment. The night is described as sending its visitors and putting its face to the glass. The night becomes a liminal space between the natural and the supernatural. It is personified into an animalistic predator that stalks its prey, seeking revenge for the damage done to it by mass consumers like Sarah. She eventually gives in to the night. Sitting on the wet ground, she closed her eyes and allowed the world without to fade. There was something just a little like sleep. The world without designated nature at this point in the story, Sarah submits herself to the liminal natural world that haunts her. Overall, the Gothic voyeurism pervades the short story as a kind of haunting. Sarah, as a mass consumer, is haunted both by characters in the liminal spaces and by nature, which is liminally positioned. In contrast, Frida from New Domne's New Zealand Flax spends her time caring for the environment and is haunted by a ghost that she yearns for, echoing the sexual undertone of Barry's story. Frida describes her orchid as being chubby, turgid, phallic, and episcopally purple. The juxtaposition of phallic and episcopally suggests an interest in sexual deviancy that would not please the church. In addition, Frida expresses that she does not want a boy or a man to come trim her garden as they would destroy it. Implying that she would allow a woman to come trim her garden, Frida can be read as having a desire for a same-sex relationship. Reading these passages together, the garden with its flowers, and by extension the natural world, become emblematic of a sexuality that may not be considered deviant by some standards, but that goes against the values of the Catholic Church, which is one of the strongest influences in Irish culture. However, rather than highlight Frida's sexual deviance through an antagonistic haunting like Sarah, Frida is haunted by a loving influence, her dead husband. She oscillates between using the past and present tense to refer to her dead husband, which indicates both her struggle to move on from his death and his occupancy of a liminal space between life and death. She even expresses a desire to join him, but her husband rebukes her by saying, "You've got to look after the New Zealand flax." In appealing to her love for nature, her dead husband recommits Frida to life. She is motivated by nature and is rewarded by it through the haunting of her husband. All in all, in both Dark Lies the Island and New Zealand Flax, haunting appears as a consequence of interacting with the environment. Where Sarah is haunted by a perverted voyeurism due to her mass consumeristic lifestyle, Frida is haunted by a loved one so he can remind her to care for nature. With many eco-critical analyses being rooted in the sense of place present in literary works, positioning these Irish short story collections in a liminal non-space or a liminal state rather than a concrete location can be read as counteracting their eco-criticism. However, the liminality of these short stories does not eliminate the fact that they heavily focus on their environment. In exploring nature in relation to character via the Irish landscape, Donnie's window, Linda's amber earrings, Sarah's bog at night, and Frida's garden, these collections mount eco-critical arguments grounded in the environment without relying on a sense of place. In fact, the juxtaposition of environmental grounding and liminality allows for a nuanced reading that illustrates the climate crisis of today. Studies have been showing for years that the planet is reaching a point of no return. Humanity is currently in the liminal space between killing the planet and saving it. Grounding stories and beautiful natural landscapes is becoming more and more difficult as modernization modifies and destroys them. Thus, literary emphasis on liminality mimics the climate crisis of our current moment, although it has gone largely ignored in our current literary analyses.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think certainly connections can be made between your discussion of non-places and your use of Foucault's ideas of heterotopias. Before opening up to questions, one myself, I'd be interested to hear you elaborate. So I like this, the sentence in your conclusion, you say that these collections of short stories mount eco-critical arguments grounded in the environment without relying on a sense of place. And I'd just like to hear you elaborate a bit more on why you think this use of liminality, of liminal spaces in these two short stories, why exactly that is counteractive or antithetical to an eco-critical approach.
It's really the idea, so specifically Irish eco-criticism, it's like a big deal over in Ireland. And it's all the stories that are being read eco-critically, they all are like, oh, it's eco-critical because it's set in the Irish Highlands, or oh, it has to do with like produce and the cows and things like that. Whereas these guys really aren't set in a specific place. A lot of them said it's a random airport. You can kind of assume it's in Ireland or it's on a train. So you think by the standards set in like current analyses of like Irish short stories, that is can't really be eco-critical. But even if they are liminal, they can still be read eco-critically, despite what like other theorists are kind of saying at the moment, or at least were saying a year ago when I wrote the essay. Yeah.
Very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience, either for Morgan or for any of the readers? Yes? Okay.
I have many questions. That's a very stimulating panel. I have a couple specific questions, one for Morgan and one for Emily, and then I have kind of general table question because there's so many interesting links between your work. So Morgan, I think you maybe gestured to it at the end of your paper, and Cameron, you just brought it up, this sort of like tension between eco-criticism being expected to focus on real spaces that are really there, but then trying to find eco-critical readings in spaces that are maybe not there, or not real spaces. Do you think that there's like any kind of connection with this and sort of the state of the environment that we're in today, where increasingly those spaces that we think of as natural are, you know, they're less and less there, they're less and less present, like, and what are your thoughts on how fiction writers can you know, create eco-critical texts about landscapes when those landscapes are kind of increasingly scarce?
Yeah, for sure. Like that's it. I was gesturing towards the idea that like completely natural, untouched spaces almost don't exist anymore today. So a lot of authors will kind of go back and like do more historical fiction texts, and then they'll be like, oh, it was so pretty before, it was so amazing, like we should make an effort to get back towards that. Kind of, I guess a little bit like, yeah, there's something to do with cottagecore there. Anyways, there's a yearning towards, oh, it was so amazing in the past, let's try to get back there. But then when it comes to writing stories set today, and if you're looking for this natural environment, it doesn't exist so much. So I guess that's it. In these guys, they were relying on earrings and things like that. It's all, I guess, more implicit rather than explicit. And I think that's what's happening with these guys. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Emily has more. Yeah, great.
More
great.
questions. Great. Oh, it's loud. So for Emily, an interesting thing that Cameron brought up and that I was really interested in your paper was the notion of this being, you know, not just a novel that includes these heterotopias, but that like significantly it's an immigrant narrative. And it seems, I'm not that familiar with Foucault's theory, but it seems as though heterotopias really kind of as spaces challenge this idea of like solid or reliable borders. So I wanted to kind of ask you what your thoughts were on that concept of borders being like really changeable, or maybe not even really existing, or being just like constructed and not very reliable as relates to the immigrant experience. And then also something else you mentioned when you answered Cameron was the idea of restriction. So it seems like there are borders there for people. There are real kind of spatial limitations, but at the same time, maybe there's an opportunity for like space to not be like a real unchangeable thing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really a tricky theory. It was really fun to work with. I think it can be definitely argued both way. I think space, like Foucault argues, is very malleable, and I think that there's a lot of borders, these kind of made up borders, I would say, that are inflicted by society to make things make sense. So in order to group people, in order to categorize things so that we have like a theory of like, okay, this works and these people are like this, but in reality, all of those borders may not actually be as clear cut as they seem to be, and they can be adjusted and they can be pushed. And this can go back to any theory. If you think about just the way that we treat minority groups, and if we're like considering intersectionality as well, there's people that are even at the cusp of of multiple borders that are inflicted by society. So then it's like, where do they belong? And then you get this whole other world of like people where they don't know where they belong in society, frankly doesn't even know where to position them. So I think definitely there is a lot of spaces that are constructed that are not as clean cut and don't have as like tight of borders as are made seem to be. But then because of these made up borders, then I think what comes out of that are actual restrictions. So I think they are very much interrelated in the sense that these pressures and limitations put on by society for different groups ends up causing them to position themselves on the outskirts, or to like kind of position themselves on the outskirts, or into like in the case of this novel, we have this family living in a church because they can't roam freely, so they are physically constricted. But then I didn't talk too much about intersectionality in this paper, but the narrator of the novel is she's an Indo-Canadian citizen, and basically I think she was brought up both like she had her Indian father's side, but then like brought up by a white Caucasian mother. So then we have these groups that can have these this minor group. We have that, like, how do I explain this? They have this minority identity, but they also have this identity that, like in this case, is white passing. So then they're like, where do I belong? Do I belong within this minority group, or do I belong out here in the public free, unlike Bassam's family that's within this church, because they have no choice. So these borders are that's why this is a tricky theory to work with, because spaces, time, do they exist? Do they not? It really depends what you're looking at. But yeah, ultimately they all can be adapted, and whatever, just to finish off this rant, whatever constriction society has placed upon us that we do see in the world today, I think what we can take out of this theory is that they can be shifted and they can be adapted, and we don't have to accept them just because that's the way it's been. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Very well said. Do we have time for any more questions? Yes? Sure?
Anyone else in the audience or online, here in person, any questions? Please raise your hand, or if you're online, please turn on your video, your camera, microphone, feel free to jump in.
Perhaps if no one else does, I have a question for Jessica. I'd be interested to hear if you think, so obviously in these pastoral poems, and as well as in this contemporary TikTok trend of cottagecore, there's this romanticization, verging on fetishization of a rural, tranquil lifestyle. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts about, one, if you think this romanticization of the rural it comes along with and cannot be removed from an anti-urban lifestyle, like an inherently anti-urban way of living. And then secondly, if this is another big question, but in an era where food scarcity is an issue and we need to maybe increase agricultural production, specifically agricultural production that's accessible and maybe closer to cities, do you think that this like romanticization of pushing people towards a rural lifestyle, could that maybe be a good thing? Pushing people towards this kind of work?
Two questions, very interesting. Okay, so the first one, anti-urbanization.
Not urbanization, but just if a rural lifestyle is inherently anti-urban, both in Marlowe's poems and in the current TikTok.
That's really interesting. I don't know that it is inherently anti-urban. I don't know that there is an extreme dichotomy between the two. I think right now in our current lifestyle and the way society is set up, there is more of an extreme. You are either living in a rural space or you are living in an urban space, and it is very difficult to have any kind of in between there. And I think a large part of that comes from the different financial backgrounds that you need to have. I mean, in order to own land right now, you need to either have access to the amount of money it takes to own land, or you need to have inherited land. It is generally not an easy thing to get access to a rural lifestyle when you're in urban spaces. But when you're in rural areas that are not especially wealthy, it's also very difficult to kind of get out of those areas and into urban spaces. There's a lot of separation between the two, where if you are not in a privileged position within either, you are kind of stuck where you are. One of the biggest appeals that Cottagecore TikToks have had is that it has kind of given people the chance to have that escapism and pretend that they are able to be in the rural life. I think coming from an urban space and being able to pretend is part of what also makes it a little bit easier to romanticize it and fetishize it. And one of the more positive impacts that Cottagecore has had is allowing people to find ways to embrace rural lifestyles within their urban centers. So it did actually lead to a huge uptick in things like local community gardens and people finding interests in those. Gardening was a huge one, and especially during the early COVID pandemic, when the only way we could all see each other was going outside and going to parks. There was a lot of people creating content that was about or with cottagecore themes, and they were in parks. There was a lot more of that content being produced because people wanted to be able to experience the other side of the life that they did not have access to.
Definitely, thank you. I think that was a great way of kind of answering both of those questions in the same thing. I believe we're running towards the end, but if there's any other final questions from the audience, perhaps we have time. And if not, I would like to thank all our readers for their readings. It was very pleasurable and stimulating, and for the audience as well. Perhaps I'll pass it to Emily to conclude.
We have nothing prepared. But I guess we just want to thank you all for coming. Thanks for making this event a success, sharing your ideas, being so smart and brilliant. Anything else?
Yeah, that's. Thank you for coming. Thank you for interacting with our speakers and for lending your limited brain power and time to this event. And yeah, we've enjoyed having you, and I hope you've enjoyed the event. And see you next year, I hope.
Yeah, and pick up your copy of the journal. Go home with one. So that's it. And then stay in schmooze. We still have some snacks and some like bubbly water and stuff. So you stay and chat some more with us. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for coming into Fourth Space and joining us online for this amazing conversation, these panels. Thank you so much. We will be going ahead and closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but as Emily said, if you're here in the space, please stick around until about 6 o'clock for some schmoozing. Just a reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. Please join us once again here at Fourth